Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everybody. So, today, continuing our discussion of non Western traditions, we're going to start by looking at Islam, and then we're going to look at the artwork of Africa, and then next time we'll get into the artwork of Oceania and the Americas. So, we have a lot to cover today. So, I'm going to try to go kind of fast, so bear with me and everything. But well, we're going to try to do this fairly quickly. So, Islam is one of the three major religions in the world. It's based on the Prophet Muhammad, and it shares some of its, kind of fundamental beliefs with Judaism and Christianity. Interestingly, Islam kind of sees itself as a continuation of these Abrahamic traditions. So they do recognize the kind of prophetic nature of many of the, kind of Judaic and Christian characters. However, they don't necessarily recognize the divinity of them or anything like that. But once again, they consider themselves a kind of continuation of this tradition. So, Islamic art itself comprises a very high level of craftsmanship. We'll see that most Islamic art is going to be more heavily focused with design kind of elements. So, there's not going to be a whole lot of figurative or representational artwork like we see in Christianity and things like that. Now, we will see some, but it's much more rare within the confines of Islam, and we'll get into the reasons for that here in a minute. But the Islamic calendar really begins in the year 622 CE, or Common Era, with the Hijra, which is Muhammad's immigration to the city of Medina from his birthplace. So, this brings about, or this is what begins the kind of journey of Islam, if you will. But within 100 years, Islam had spread out to much of the former Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire, as well as places in North Africa, Spain, and other parts of Europe as time goes on. So here we can see kind of within that 100-year span, the kind of extent of the Muslim conquest, if you will. However, in later times, the Ottoman Empire will also extend influence up into the Balkan region of Eastern Europe there, and et cetera, et cetera, and it will continue on throughout Southern Asia, into China, India, Southeast Asia, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, now obviously we have people of the Muslim faith all over the world and everything like that. So once again, one of the three major religions in the world, at least 1 billion practitioners, and everything like that. Now, what's interesting is that early on, the Muslims facilitated their rule by allowing the people of conquered lands to retain their own religions and cultures, much as the Romans had. However, this usually comes with some, kind of conditions. So, for instance, throughout the Middle Ages, the Muslims in the Holy Lands definitely allowed, Jews and Christians to continue their faith. However, we might have to pay a tax in order to do that. Things like that. It's really, kind of more recently where we start to see some of the more, extremism and, all that kind of stuff that we should be familiar with. But what's interesting is this allowed Muslims to adopt earlier, artistic traditions from varying cultures. So we'll see that, not only does the, artwork of Islam incorporate its own aesthetics and its own kind of trends, but it will also incorporate the aesthetic trends of, say, the Indian subcontinent or, North Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So they kind of blend indigenous art forms into their own kind of lexicon as well. But at its height from the 9th to the 14th centuries, Islamic culture synthesized not only the artistic and literary traditions as well as the scientific knowledge of the entire ancient world. So it's really during this period where, what we would consider to be kind of the dark ages in Western Europe or the medieval period where a lot of this ancient Greco-Roman knowledge is kind of being rejected in favor of, very fundamentalist Christian ideology. But in the Eastern world, or the Mediterranean, the Middle East, all of this, Islamic scholars are actually keeping a lot of this ancient knowledge alive. They're actually, going forth and creating new sciences, mathematics, all kinds of things like this. It's, within the Muslim world that at this time that we get algebra and, other major mathematical and scientific innovations. So it's a kind of an interesting period. And so, unlike Christian Europe, which had largely rejected most of this knowledge, at least in this time period, we see that there's kind of the opposite effect in the Middle Eastern world, in North Africa, and all of these places. And so it's really this kind of keeping this knowledge alive that helps to facilitate the Renaissance later on and everything like this. So it's really an interesting kind of phenomenon. However, between the 8th and 11th centuries, Arabic becomes a major language of scholarship. And so here we can see a depiction. This is the scholars at the Abbasid Library in Baghdad. And so, here we have a group of Muslim scholars and, this library rack behind them. But once again, they're doing all kinds of different things. They're translating ancient texts into Arabic, and so many people would actually go to Muslim lands, especially in Europe. People would travel to places like Spain, and they would learn how to read and write Arabic so that they could make translations of these texts themselves, so that they could read them, etc., etc. So it's a very interesting kind of connotation there. Now, when it comes to actual Muslim art, as I mentioned, most of it is going to be much more decorative in nature. It's really not going to have representational imagery quite so much as like we see in Europe. And one of the reasons for this is that traditional Muslims frown upon the representation of the human figure in art, especially when it's used in a religious context. So most Islamic religious art is going to be much more design oriented, whereas figurative artwork is going to be much more rare. Now it does exist, and we'll see some examples of it, but it's just not really the forefront in this given aesthetic. But a lot of this is also tied to this idea that similar to abstraction in medieval Christian artwork and Byzantine artwork, trying to recreate the human form is kind of considered to be in competition with God or the divine. So when we're trying to create something that's realistic, we're basically competing with the divine creation, if you will. And so, therefore, a lot of the representational imagery that we do see is very heavily stylized and fairly abstract, comparatively speaking. So, once again, a lot of the artwork in this Islamic context is going to be much more design-oriented, and we'll see that here in just a second. Now, I do want to give fair warning. I'm going to show two images now that could be considered rather controversial. I want to emphasize that I do not show them to be offensive in any way. Both of them come from Muslim sources originally. And so, but I think they speak to not only this idea about the prohibition against, imagery within a religious context, but one also shows kind of how Muslims view themselves within the continuation of this Abrahamic tradition. So, Muhammad himself forbade depictions of himself because he claimed that he was nothing exceptional and that he was really just a prophet or a mouthpiece for the divine word. So it's really kind of, and I'm sure we know in recent times, there's been a lot of, kind of issues regarding depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. But, I do like to show this image because one, it does come from a Muslim source, but it also represents or at least how Muslims view themselves within this content or this continuation. So what we see here is Muhammad leads Abraham, Moses, and Jesus in prayer. And so once again, here we see Muhammad on the right side, and then we have Abraham, Moses, and Jesus on the left, along with two other prophets from the Old and New Testaments as well. So what's interesting about this is we do have a kind of hierarchical scale that goes on. We see that all of the figures are wreathed in a halo. In this sense, in the Muslim connotation, a halo usually takes on more of this appearance of like a kind of flame around the head or the body, which is kind of interesting in my opinion. But we can see that within this context, Muhammad being the most important individual is fully wreathed in this kind of fiery halo, whereas our other prophets have just one around their head. But once again, this is an image that shows this kind of continuation. Even though Muslims do not recognize the quote-unquote divinity of Jesus, they still recognize him as being a prophet of God, if you will. And so, once again, they're seeing themselves more as a continuation of this tradition rather than being the kind of end-all, be-all, if you will. But once again, this is a very, very rare depiction. I'm surprised that this was even made, to be honest. But this was made. This is done in Persia, or what is modern-day Iran. Most figurative artwork within the Muslim context is going to be coming out of Persia for the most part. And we'll see some more examples of that here in a minute. However, if you do see images of the Prophet Muhammad, most of the time it's going to be much more akin to this. And so what we see here is, this is Muhammad at Mount Hira, and this is the location in which he is said to receive received his prophetic revelation. So we actually see, Muhammad depicted in white here, but to circumvent this idea of not, literally depicting him, he's usually depicted with a veil over his face so that we are not technically representing his physical form. Instead, it's more just to give an idea of it. But we do see this is an illustration that's taken from a Persian Quran. So we can see the Arabic Kufic calligraphy, which is one of our other major aspects within this aesthetic tradition as well. And we'll get into that in a second. But we can see the kind of host of angels in the heavens there relating the word of God to him and everything like that. Once again, we can see him kind of wreathed in this halo of fire, if you will. But once again, this is the more common way that he's going to be depicted within the Islamic context. However, this is still an extremely, extremely rare image as well. But once again, I show these two not to be offensive, but in order to, represent how we might go about doing this, but also to represent how, Muslims view themselves within the context of these other major religions as well. Now, aside from that, one of the major aspects of Islamic art, once again, is decorative in nature, and this usually takes place in a mosque. And a mosque, or the word mosque, literally means place of kneeling, but it is an architectural structure used in the religious devotion of Islam, as we should be familiar. But here we can see probably one of the more interesting mosques in the world. This is the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, in Turkey, modern-day Turkey. This was originally a Byzantine cathedral. It was indeed one of the first major cathedrals ever built within the Christian context, but it was later, transformed into a mosque by the Ottoman Empire much, much later. But we can see one of the major hallmarks of a mosque, and that would be the minaret towers, which were later additions to this building. So we can see those on the four corners of the building, and we'll get more into those here in a second. Now, I think it's important to note as well that the design for mosques are largely based on the design of the Prophet's house, which had an open courtyard surrounded by a colonnade. So a lot of mosques, especially early ones that are specifically built to be mosques that aren't, repurposed from older buildings such as the Hagia Sophia, are going to be modeled largely off of this idea of the prophet's house. And so here we can see a simple diagram that's meant to be a kind of recreation of what his house was thought to have looked like. So we can see that, there's some rooms, there's a kind of covered colonnade, and a large courtyard in the center. So many mosques that you'll see kind of echo this idea, such as the Great Mosque of Kairouan in Tunisia, which we see here. So this is in northern Africa. But what we can see is, once again, a colonnade surrounding an open courtyard. We can see our minaret tower, and then we can see the actual sanctuary, okay? So what I find interesting about this is that, not only do we have the sanctuary here in the back, but this open courtyard actually serves another purpose aside from being a religious structure. This is also a place where people could gather. Many times there's a fountain or fountains associated with these courtyards as well, which are usually used for ritualistically cleansing oneself. So we would usually remove our shoes and wash our feet before entering into the sanctuary, but this would also serve as a place where we could have public gatherings, where we could, just receive water in general if we needed it and everything like that. But we also have, with the colonnade, an area to kind of get out of the heat and everything like that. But then we also have the minaret tower, and this is a major feature of many mosques. We could think of this being somewhat similar to a bell tower in like a Christian church or cathedral, in that it's used to help, call the faithful to prayer and everything like that. So mosques usually include one or more of these minaret towers, which help to indicate the building, but are also used to call the worshipers to prayer. So 5 times a day, one of the kind of religious figures associated with the mosque will actually climb the tower, and then they issue forth a call. And this would be not only a way that we could keep time, but we would also be able to keep track of our daily prayers and everything like that. So here we can see one of the more interesting examples of a minaret tower. This is the spiral minaret at the Great Mosque of Shamara. This is in modern day Iraq. And it's this kind of, spiraling, kind of tower. But interestingly, this is one of the kind of artistic influences on medieval Christian ideas about the Tower of Babel and other things like that. You'll see many depictions of the Tower of Babel that look very similar to this. So I've always found that to be kind of interesting. Once again, this would be influenced by, Christians going to the Middle East during the Crusades and all kinds of things like that. But once again, most mosques are going to have at least one or more of these minaret towers in association with them. Now, aside from the minaret, another major feature of a mosque is what's known as the mihrab. And this is a niche in the end wall of the mosque that is oriented to face towards Mecca. So Mecca is the kind of holy site within Islam. It's where the Prophet Muhammad is born, and everything like that. So all mosques are oriented to face towards Mecca, no matter where they're at. And this niche, this mihrab in the end wall, is used to indicate that. So that if we, the faithful, were occupying that space, we would know which direction in order to make our prayers in. So this is an interesting structure. We could think of it somewhat akin to the altar space in a Christian church. However, it does not serve the same ritualistic kind of purpose. Whereas an altar, there are actual rituals that take place there. There are not rituals that take place at the mihrab. Instead, it's just more of an indication. But we can see that many of them, such as this one coming out of Yazd, Iran, are very heavily decorated, not only in geometric tile work, but they usually also incorporate a large amount of calligraphy. So we'll see calligraphy and geometric kind of motifs are the main kind of decorative element within Islamic art. So if we look, it might be a little hard to see, but all around the outside of this mihrab, as well as on the interior here, is Arabic Kufic calligraphy taken straight from the Quran. And the point of this is to, like, stained glass or the imagery within, a Christian cathedral, this calligraphy is meant to be read by the faithful, and it's meant to enhance our spiritual experience within that moment. So these would be, quotes from the Quran that would help us to, entice or enhance our spiritual experience in that moment. So there are things that we should contemplate, et cetera, as we're making our prayers. Now, these mihrabs vary quite a bit depending on where we're at. Some of them are very simple, some of them are much more grandiose. Once again, over time, they began to be much more elaborate. Here we can see one example from Cordoba in Spain. This is kind of the major seat of Islamic power in Spain throughout the Middle Ages. But we can see, once again, very, very kind of heavy use of geometric motifs, very symmetrical geometric motifs. So it creates this kind of harmonious whole to it. But we can also see, in this case especially, a really large amount of Kufic calligraphy being used in this as well. And once again, all of this calligraphy that we see around the exterior and above here is all taken straight from the Quran as well. Now, aside from geometric motifs and calligraphy, we see that ceramic arts are very, very highly valued in Islam. And in fact, these ceramic arts are usually what we're using to decorate many of these kind of mihrabs and interiors of mosques and things like that. So one of the more interesting examples of this comes out of the 9th century in Iraq, or modern day Iraq. And potters there perfected the art of what's known as lusterware. And lusterware owes itself in large part to the practice of alchemy as well. But this is a glazing technique that imparts a kind of metallic sheen to the surface of, a ceramic vessel. So we can take, a piece of clay and make it look like it's kind of metallic, if you will. So it's kind of interesting. We'll see some examples. But lusterware is one of the most difficult ceramic processes to control, and as such, it's usually reserved much more for royalty and as well for the use in mosques and everything like that to enhance the kind of overall, kind of presence of the building and everything like that. So, lusterware also tends to be equated with alchemy, as I said, and especially in the past. If we're unfamiliar, alchemy is this kind of foolish attempt to turn simple materials into gold. But alchemy does bring about many of the kind of earliest forms of scientific method that we know of. So a lot of various, kind of things that we take for granted today actually have their origins in alchemy as well. So it's kind of interesting. But most lusterware is really reserved, once again, for the nobility and for, mosque architecture and things like that. But here we can see an example of some lusterware. This is actually a wine jug from the 17th century. And it's a little hard to tell just based on photographs. If you ever get the chance to see some of this in person, it definitely has a much different look to it in person than in a photograph. But we can see that it has this very highly reflective, polished surface. And this is, in part to that lusterware technique. But we can also see in this particular image that, once again, figurative representation is going to be fairly rare, at least more on the rare side. It really kind of depends on where we're at within the Muslim world. But we see that, things like geometric motifs are very common, floral motifs are very common, as well as calligraphy motifs. So in this particular case, we have a large amount of floral and geometric designs within the motif work on this particular vase. However, it's not always that case. Sometimes calligraphy is much more prominent. So here we can see a bowl made with the lusterware technique from the 13th century. But we can see that calligraphy and geometric design motifs are much more prevalent in this particular example. So we can see, or perhaps we can see, aspects of calligraphy around the exterior, which are actually, in this case, blended somewhat into the design element of the geometry as well. But we can also see it echoed here and there. but we can see that this kind of swirling kind of geometric motif is very common. Once again, this is owing in some part to this, kind of tradition coming out of Asian traditions as well, being a little bit more on the curvilinear side. So once again, this kind of depends where we're at and, what time period we're in and everything like that. Now, that doesn't mean that, representational imagery isn't, available within this. So here we can see a lusterware jar or vessel that actually has representational imagery. This time coming out of Iran. Once again, most of the Islamic representational art is coming out of what is today Iran, or historically known as Persia. But we can see here a nice kind of hunting scene. So we have a kind of nobleman situated on his camel, and he's hunting a deer. And then he has his attendants here and everything like that. But we can also see that floral and geometric motifs are also very prevalent within this as well, especially in the design elements around the exterior of the vessel and everything like that. But once again, here we just have another example that I think really shows that kind of luster, metallic kind of being a little bit better. So we can see this kind of copper-esque, glaze on this particular, bowl. But, so once again, it has this kind of metallic quality to it, which I find very interesting. But once again, we can see, in this case, geometry and floral motifs very, very prevalent. And we can also see that this kind of harmonious use of extreme symmetry is also very, very prevalent, within this kind of artwork as well. So in the Islamic context, you'll always see geometry, calligraphy, extreme symmetry are all going to be the major components, and then floral and representational motifs are going to be a little bit more downplayed. Even the floral motifs tend to take on a much more geometric kind of quality to them as well. But it's not just, utilitarian objects such as these bowls and vessels that we've seen that are made using this lusterware technique. In fact, a lot of decorative tile work is done with this technique as well. So here we can see a nice example. This time we have our Kufic calligraphy around the exterior, but we also have floral and animal motifs in this case as well. So we have two cranes there as well. But many of these types of lusterware tiles are actually used in the decoration of mosques and the mihrabs and everything like that. So here we can see an example, a very early example coming out of Tunisia, northern Africa, where these lusterware tiles are being placed around to create the kind of design element within this mihrab itself. So once again, this is a little bit more of a simple mihrab earlier on, but our other mihrabs that we saw a few minutes ago also incorporate this lusterware tile work in their design. So it can become very, very extreme, if you will, or it can be much more simple, such as we see here. Now, aside from lusterware, calligraphy is another major aspect of Islamic art, especially within the religious context. So unlike Christian Europe, where we're going to have all kinds of representational imagery that's telling the stories of the Bible, etc., etc., in the context of Islam, we're going to have more calligraphy being used to accentuate the kind of beauty of the written word, if you will, within the confines of the Quran. So calligraphy is seen as important for its use enhancing the beauty of the divine word. So you'll often see within Quranic literature the use of calligraphy to highlight specific, passages and everything like that, which we're meant to contemplate and, kind of take into consideration more and more. But Quranic calligraphy is really the most highly praised of all of this. But what's interesting is that the decorative qualities of Arabic script combine well with both geometric and floral design motifs. And so it can vary quite a bit. And in fact, you'll see a lot of Kufic Arabic calligraphy that's kind of morphed into a variety of different shapes and elements and things like that. And once again, this is all used to enhance this kind of overall kind of aesthetic feeling of the written word itself. But here we can see an example of Kufic calligraphy. This is actually the word Allah, or the name of God, if you will. So you'll see this particular script quite a bit in a lot of different contexts. But here we can see an example of a page of Kufic calligraphy taken from the Quran. This is actually coming out of the Mamluk dynasty in India, so a little bit further abreast, but this is also coming somewhat out of this Persian tradition. It has at least some Persian influence to it as well. But we can see that the majority of the page we have our Kufic calligraphy, but then one particular passage here in the middle is kind of highlighted and made a little bit more elaborate with the addition of these kind of geometric floral motifs around it as well. And so this is once again meant to highlight this particular passage so that if we are reading this, we would kind of focus a little bit more attention on this particular kind of passage as it relates to our faith and everything like that. But what I find interesting is that, once again, this calligraphy has a wide range of design elements that can be incorporated into this. And this is, in fact, in modern times, but also in ancient times, something that's very, very extensively done. So here we can see an example of what's known as the basmala, and this is a kind of written prayer. If we were to translate it, it literally states, "In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful." But we can see that the kind of calligraphy script has been morphed into the shape of a pear hanging from a branch there. So once again, we can do quite a bit with this based on the kind of decorative, flowing nature of Arabic script in general. But I do like to show, here we have just another example of this, and this is the basmala once again. So it's the exact same prayer, however, this time coming out of the Mughal era of India versus our more modern interpretation just a second ago. But we can see that we can make it much more geometric, we can make it, much more symmetrically oriented and all kinds of things like this. So it's really, really varied. There's all kinds of different things. I've seen the same prayer done in, animal forms, all kinds of different stuff. So I've always found that to be really interesting about Arabic script in general. Now, if we move on from there, one of the more interesting aspects of Islamic art actually takes place in Spain. And so Spain and Spanish kind of aesthetics are very heavily tied to this period of Muslim involvement in Spain between the kind of Middle Age period. But here we can see this area in green is largely the area controlled by the Muslims in Spain. But we'll see down here at Granada and Cordoba are the kind of main, areas of this. But one of the great kind of examples of Islamic architecture and artwork actually comes from Granada. And that is the Alhambra Citadel. And what I find interesting about this, the Alhambra Citadel is not only a palace, but it's also a very large kind of fortification. It's basically like a kind of self-contained city, if you will. But when the Spanish actually reconquered Spain for Christian Europe, they actually were so impressed with this structure that they left it completely intact. In fact, the Spanish royalty used this structure quite a bit for their own purposes. But once again, it's a massive complex. It's a self-contained city essentially. But what we will be looking at is the actual kind of palace complex, which we see here in the square. But it's an interesting kind of array of design elements. Here we can see what's known as the Court of the Lions. So we have a courtyard with a fountain in the center. There's also a mosque associated with this as well that was later converted into a church. But we can see here, this kind of what gives it its namesake, this fountain that's supported by these statues of lions. And this is a very common kind of theme coming out of ancient Mesopotamian and Persian kind of aesthetic. It's blended into Islam quite a bit, and that the lion comes to be associated with like kingly power, divine power, all of these kinds of things. So you'll see a lot of lion motifs quite a bit. We'll see some more here in a few minutes as well. But once again, we can see this colonnade, and all of this colonnade is actually very elaborately decorated in symmetrical geometric motifs, and we'll see some examples. But once again, the sheer magnitude of this palace is just overwhelming. If you ever get a chance to go, I would highly recommend it. But once again, it's overwhelming in how elaborate the detail and the carving of all the stonework is in this palace. But we can see here once again our geometric floral motifs. We can also see calligraphy used quite extensively all throughout and everything like that. But what I find really interesting about this stonework is that it's actually done in such a delicate manner that light is able to pass through it. And so it gives it this kind of ethereal feeling. And so we can perhaps see that here, in that we have these little places within the patterning that are actually punctured through, and it allows light to come through. So we've actually made stone somewhat translucent. And so I've always found this to be interesting. But once again, we can see just how elaborate all of this really is. And once again, we can see this extreme use of symmetrical geometry as well as calligraphy and everything like that. But here we can see just another example of this. This perhaps shows the kind of see-through quality of this stonework much better. So we can see, this is a roof, but it's giving this essence or this kind of quality that looks like the stars of heaven shining above us and all of that kind of idea. So I've always found this to be really, really interesting. But once again, we can also see extreme use of symmetrical balance within the geometric motifs work in this. And just another example here, just to show once again the kind of elaborate quality of it. This particular one also has another interesting feature. So not only do we see the calligraphy quite a bit, but we also see this really intricate geometric patterning down here. But what's interesting is that there's oftentimes a small flaw that's put into this intentionally, so as to not be completely perfect, and so as therefore not to be in competition with the divine as well. So even though it might look extremely symmetrical and extremely perfect, there are oftentimes very, very small elements that kind of throw that symmetry off if you look really closely. And once again, this is in order to not be in competition with the divine. Now, if we move on from Spain to Persia, we see some other interesting kind of elements of Islamic art. Here we can see kind of an area that is, all of this area in orange, depending on what time period we're talking about, has historically been associated with Persia or the Persian Empire. But generally speaking, Persia refers to what is now modern day Iran, kind of in this region here. But one of the best known kind of Persian art forms, especially in the Western world, is the Persian rug or the carpet. And so here we can see one example. What I find interesting about this is that all of these carpets are handmade by individually tying knots together, and they create these very, very elaborate designs with this. So this is also an art form that is traditionally made by women, whereas lusterware and things like that are traditionally made by men and things like that. But here we can see a nice example. This is a Persian hunting carpet. So most of these carpets serve a very utilitarian function, whereas like a lot of these, kind of similar like tapestry designs in Europe are more aesthetic. This would actually be used as the floor for a hunting tent. And it's a little hard to see, but if we actually looked up really close, we see all of these hunters on horseback that are chasing down deer and other game and everything like that. So it's all kind of sprinkled throughout. But then we also have this large amount of floral motif work within the confines of the main image in the center. And then once again, all of our geometric work around, around the exterior as well. But if we look at just a little bit of a close-up of it, this is a different carpet, but we can see just how elaborate some of this design work really is. In this case, we have, in addition to geometry, we have floral and animal life in this one. So we have a variety of exotic birds and flowers sprinkled throughout the main kind of body of the carpet here as well. So once again, something else that's interesting, most of these carpets are all utilizing natural dyes as well, especially earlier on. But they create these very, very vivid, kind of representations. These rugs are still extremely popular all over the world, even today. But here we can see just a little bit even more of a close-up, so we can see, once again, coming out of our ancient Persian aesthetic, we have this motif of the lion and the bull once again. So this is hearkening back to the ancient times in Persia, in which the lion is a symbol of the sun and of kingly power, and the bull is kind of symbol of the earth. So this is probably meant more for royal use, this particular example. But once again, it's showing that kind of idea of the, Persia's claim to, mastery of the world and all that kind of stuff. But we can also see some interesting elements here in the design elements, especially these kind of cloud-like shapes, which are also very heavily reminiscent of Chinese ink painting and design, motifs as well. So once again, there's some interesting crossover. Iran or Persia historically butted up against, the Western kind of boundaries of China, and they definitely had influence via the Silk Road and all of these kinds of things. But what I think is interesting too is that this Persian carpet aesthetic is still going quite strong. This is actually a modern contemporary artist that I follow on Instagram named Faig Ahmed. But he's taking these traditional kind of aspects and blending them with abstract work as well. I've always thought these were really cool. But once again, it's an aesthetic that's still going very, very strong even today. Now, aside from the carpet, the Persians are also really well known for their illustration, and most of their illustration is actually not really in reference to the Quran or religious work, but more in terms of literary work. And so here we can see a nice example. This is actually done by a Persian sultan. So this is done by Sultan Muhammad, but this is meant to represent a scene from actual history, but it's also meant to be a kind of moral treatise as well. So it's meant to have a moral message behind it. So what we see here is the old woman complaining to Sultan Sanjar. So we can see this old woman in blue and white, and she stopped the Sultan Sanjar here in green to make a complaint to him. And in the story, she's complaining that one of his soldiers has robbed her of her property. And the Sultan basically rebukes her and is like, ugh, what are your concerns to mine? Like, I am the ruler of this land. My time is more important. To which the old woman replies, how can you rule an empire when you can't even rule your own? And it's meant to be this kind of crushing, blow to the Sultan's ego, if you will. And once again, it's meant to, being that this image is created by another sultan, it's meant to echo this idea to, other rulers in the lineage that, you need to rule with, your kind of emotions. You need to be, equal in your treatment to all of your subjects. You need to be fair and all of these kinds of things. So I find that to be interesting, but we can also see that this, once again, trying not to be in, competition with the divine creation. We see that it's very heavily stylized, also aiding to that kind of Asian aesthetic trend. We see that many of the forms are depicted much more sensual, have a much more kind of curvilinear feel to them, especially in the faces. It might be a little hard to see here. But we can also see in this a very heavy influence from Chinese ink painting, especially within the confines of the landscape. So a lot of the cloud work back here is very reminiscent of some of the cloud work that we saw on our Ming Dynasty, porcelain jars and everything like that. This would be coming out of the same time period as the Ming Dynasty as well. So once again, we see that Islam is embracing, current or, trends of other cultures that it's interacting with and all kinds of things like this, at least during this time period. But here we have just another example of a Persian, miniature painting or illustration. This one also coming out of the context of the Quran. Here we can see this is the Mirage of the Prophet. So we actually have another rare example of a representation of Muhammad. But once again, we can see that he is veiled so as to not actually show him. But we can see him wreathed in flame. He's meant to be riding a unicorn in this sense, but we also see him surrounded by the seraphim. So we can see, I believe this is meant to be the Archangel Gabriel or maybe Michael. But once again, showing this kind of connection to these other biblical figures as well, and this kind of biblical narrative. But once again, this has an almost distinctly Chinese kind of look to it as well in the actual quality of, the cloud work and how people are represented and everything like this. So I find that to be kind of interesting as well. Now, if we move on from Persia, which we have right over in here, we also have Islam spreading out into India and other parts of Asia. One of the major aspects of this is the Mughal Empire in India, which we see here in green at its height. The Mughal Empire is really at its height between 1526 and 1719, and then it begins to wane until its ultimate decline in 1857 at the hands of the British. But during its heyday, this was a very interesting, kind of empire in that it's, not only this kind of heir to this Persian aesthetic, but it's also this heir to this Mongol tradition. So we see this blending of Persian and Chinese kind of aesthetics coming in. But what's interesting is that the Mughal Empire ruled a wide variety of cultures. So it's not just Muslims, it's Hindus, it's Buddhists, it's Sikhs, it's, Jains, and all kinds of different faiths. But in this, only the Mughal aristocracy were Muslims. So only the king and the kind of royal family and the royalty in general were Muslim. But they begin to evolve Islam further and further from its Arab roots in this sense, because the Mughals tend to be some of the more tolerant rulers in the world, especially for this time. So in particular, many Mughal rulers would go out and, send emissaries out to learn about the different religions in the realm. So they would go learn about, Buddhism and Hinduism and all of these. And so that they could help to facilitate their rule even better, so that they could be fair and, equal in their treatment to the subjects and everything like that. In fact, there's at least one Mughal ruler that interacted with Portuguese missionaries when they came to India for the first time, and he had a number of Christian religious paintings in his palace. Once again, it just shows that they're interested in this kind of scholastic endeavor and everything like that. So kind of an interesting feat there. But the Mughals are also really well known for their illustration as well, coming out of this Persian tradition. So here we can see one such illustration, and this is the Emperor Jakhari visiting an ascetic. So if we remember, an ascetic hermit is someone that gives up all worldly possessions in order to seek enlightenment. Siddhartha, the Buddha himself, was an ascetic hermit. So we can see once again this idea of the Muslim Mughal rulers going out into the land and learning about their subjects and interacting with other religions that are not their own in order to better facilitate their rule and everything like that. But perhaps the best known Mughal art comes from one particular ruler, and that is a man named Shah Jahan. And he's really the last great Mughal ruler. It's after him that the empire begins to decline, or at least begins its gradual, kind of decline into obscurity. But here we can see an illustration of Shah Jahan, also coming out of this, Persian aesthetic of miniature painting. But we can see once again all of this really rich, elaborate, geometric decoration and everything like that. But what Shah Jahan is really well known for is this structure, and this is the Taj Mahal. And what's interesting about the Taj Mahal is that it is probably the largest and most grandiose example of an artwork devoted solely to romantic love that has ever been made. So this structure is actually meant to be a tomb, and it was a tomb for this woman. So this is Mahmud's Mahal. This is the Shah's kind of first wife, his most beloved wife. She died very young in childbirth, but he builds this massive edifice to her memory. And in fact, he actually has himself buried in it alongside her. So here we can see the tomb of Mahmud's and then the tomb of Shah Jahan there. But once again, this is very, very elaborate. All of the decorative work that we see in the Taj Mahal is made out of precious stone inlay. So the entire thing is built out of white marble with precious stone inlay. And in fact, if it was ever destroyed now, it would cost hundreds of billions of dollars to recreate. That's just how elaborate it is. But if we look at some of the details of it, we see all of our same kind of motif work, geometry, floral, and calligraphy motifs being very, very common. But we can see not only is there very rich decorative carving and relief sculpture, but we also see all of this, kind of scroll work around it is all made out of precious stone inlay. So this is all made out of jade and malachite and, ruby and all kinds of different things. And it's just elaborate. It's just massively elaborate. The entire structure is covered in this stuff. But here we can see just how intricate some of that inlay really is. And so once again, this is something that would have taken years to make and everything like this. It's just grandiose in its nature. But we can also see that, once again, calligraphy is very heavily prevalent in this as well. All of this calligraphy is also made out of precious stone inlay. I believe this particular set of calligraphy is made with black onyx. Once again, another precious stone. But something else I find interesting about the Taj Mahal itself is that it actually changes color throughout the day. So because it's stark white, marble, as the sun reflects across the day, it actually kind of changes colors throughout the day. So, it might be kind of pinkish orange in the early morning or at twilight, but, like really glaring white in midday and everything like that. So once again, it's all meant to echo this kind of grandiose quality, but, and, show this kind of romantic love that he felt for his wife and everything like that. Now, from there, we're going to move on to Africa. We're going to look at some of the major influences in African art. Now, it's important to note that the art of Africa is extremely varied with a very diverse reflection of different cultures and customs and everything like this. Africa itself is larger than the US, China, and Europe combined. Very, very massive place. And so quite a bit of different artwork that's happening there. However, North of the Sahara Desert, the artwork and art forms in Africa tend to fall under the influence of things like Egypt and Rome, and then later Islamic traditions, all of which we've really talked about. So for this part, we're going to look more at sub-Saharan Africa, so the lower half of Africa. And even though these cultures in this region vary quite a bit, there are some commonalities in some of the artworks that they make. Many of them serve ritualistic types of purposes. So we obviously can't get to everything, but we're going to try to show a nice kind of variety of things as well. So, sub-Saharan Africa. So most art from this area of the world is made or was made with perishable materials. So consequently, little of it's really survived from before the 13th century. So prior to the Middle Ages, most of that artwork is just lost to us because it's made out of wood or it's made out of ceramic, like unfired or sun-baked clay, that kind of stuff. Feather work, bead work, all kinds of things that just don't hold up to the test of time quite as well. And once again, depending on where we're at in Africa, we can have, either tropical rainforests or arid grasslands and all kinds of different things. Weather plays a large role in the preservation of these materials and everything like that. However, 10 miners in central Nigeria accidentally unearthed what is considered to be one of the oldest surviving examples of sub-Saharan artwork dating back to the Greco-Roman period. So just because, this artwork from before the 13th century is rare, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But what they found is related to what's known as the Nook culture. And so here we can see an area in red, which is largely associated with the Nook culture in what is today, present day, or modern day, Nigeria, Niger, Benin. It even extends down into Cameroon and some other places. But this is kind of the hook of Africa, if you will, where it kind of curves down. So a lot of the artwork that we're going to look at today is going to be featured in this region as well as a little further south and everything like that. But what they find is this. And so this is what the 10 miners in Nigeria found. But this is considered to be one of the oldest surviving examples of, pre-medieval African artwork that's ever been discovered. But we can see here a variety of aspects within this given work of art that will go on to influence much of the rest of African artwork of this region for centuries to come. And so what we see here is a portrait head. And from the Nook culture, this is made out of terracotta, and it's dated between 5 and 200 BCE. So this is roughly concurrent with ancient Greece. But what we can see here is thought to be a portrait effigy. So this would be a portrait made of a prominent individual within a tribe, probably a king or a venerated ancestor. This would have been made in order to placate the ancestors, so as a form of ancestral worship. Many African religions kind of blend animism, a kind of shamanistic-like religion, with ancestral worship and spirit worship and all of these kinds of things. So you do see a lot of these portrait head representations, and we'll see more examples going forward as well. But we can also see a major aspect of African art or sub-Saharan African art, and it is this rather pronounced exaggeration of human human features within a representation. And so many times you'll see that facial features especially tend to be elongated. Eyes especially tend to be very vivid and open wide. This is kind of meant to reference this whole idea of the spiritual kind of awakening of a person or the spiritual presence of a person. But you'll also usually see these kinds of representations very richly adorned in either decoration, specific hairstyles, sometimes things that indicate certain tribal allegiances. We'll see a little more of that here in a second as well. But once again, this would be, or is at least thought to be, a representation of a venerated ancestor or a king or a chieftain that would have come before, and we would use it in a kind of quasi religious like practice, if you will. But we do have other examples from the Nook culture. Here we can see another human figure, this time a little bit more elaborate, but once again we can see many of these same hallmarks in that the human form tends to be exaggerated and kind of stretched out somewhat. We also have the addition of those very large, open, kind of wide eyes as well. But I really like this example because we get a sense for not only the jewelry that's being worn by this individual, so we can see that they're adorned in, quite a bit of jewelry. Not only this very elaborate beaded necklace, but armbands. I really love the detail in the hair and the headdress on this particular figure as well. But once again, just a lot of these artworks are going to have this rather pronounced, exaggerated quality within the human form. And so here we can see an even more pronounced version of this, an even more stylized representation. But here we can see a Nook, rider and a horse. So, even the kind of animal forms tend to be somewhat exaggerated as well. And we'll see some other examples of that. But once again, most of this Nook culture artwork is going to be made out of terracotta. It's very, very rare, once again, given its age. However, little has survived from the Nook culture, unfortunately, once again, due to the perishable nature of the materials that they're using. But its art, however, seems to have influenced other West African cultures quite extensively. So, concurrent with roughly the Gothic period in Europe in the 12th century, a very naturalistic style of court portraiture was developed in Ife, a sacred Yoruba city in southwestern Nigeria. And so this continues this tradition of the portrait head of a venerated ancestor or, kind of person. So if we look at the modern map of Nigeria, Ife is situated down here toward the south. Benin is another major center, and we'll see some examples from there as well. But generally speaking, what we're about to see comes out of this city, Ife, here. And this is what they create. And so what we see here is a male portrait head, and this is made out of cast bronze. So once again, this shows that these people are very adept at metallurgy. They're creating, very large, elaborate, bronze work. Once again, this takes on an even more realistic, naturalistic kind of appearance as opposed to earlier and later cultures, which tend to be much more heavily abstracted and stylized. So I find that to be kind of interesting. But what's interesting is, once again, this is thought to be a representation of a king or a chieftain or venerated ancestor, and it would have been used within the culture as a veneration tool in a kind of religious sense. In that we are kind of, making offerings to our ancestors who are going to help us in our daily lives and everything like that. Now, what I also find interesting about these is that, and we'll see some examples in a second, we can see perhaps these perforated holes all around it. And many of these also have headdresses associated with them. And it's thought too that these holes down here around the man's beard might have had actual natural fibers in them at one time as well. And so it would have enhanced the realistic kind of appearance of them and everything like that. And so we'll see some different examples. But we can also see an interesting feature in this particular one, and indeed all of these, portrait heads coming out of Ife in general, is this kind of striation on the face. And it's thought that, this could potentially just be a design element that's meant to echo the kind of undulations of the form. However, I think it's, more akin to a type of facial scarification, and we'll see examples of that in a second. But this would be a way to indicate one's tribal allegiance. Many different cultures do things like this, not only through scarification, but tattooing, all kinds of different things. So this would probably not only mark the individual as a very prominent individual within the society, but it would also, kind of show where his allegiance lie within the kind of broader culture as well. But here we can see just another example of one of these portrait heads, this time with its headdress intact, or, this is probably much more akin to a crown. But we can also see those holes drilled. So once again, this might have actually had natural fibers attached to it at one time as well. It's also thought that many of these bronze portrait heads probably had full torsos associated with them at one time as well. So they might have been even more, kind of elaborate at one time. All of these portrait heads are life size as well. But it's not just male figures that are represented in these, it's also female figures. So here we can see a female figure. This would probably be a chieftain's wife or perhaps a queen mother of some kind. But once again, we can see this really nice, elaborate headdress that she's wearing. We can see her features are much softer, much more rounded, so much more sensual. But once again, we still see that kind of facial striation there. But once again, this is thought to be a form of facial scarification, or at least a reference to it. Here we can see a tribal or tribesman from Nigeria. This photograph was taken in the 1930s, but we can see some of that facial scarification, which is probably what these striated lines are meant to represent, or at least in one form or another. But once again, these would be something that would show where our allegiances lied, our identity, and all kinds of things like this. Many of these types of decorations, whether it be scarification or tattooing, tend to show a wide variety of cultural kind of meaning and influence and all kinds of things like that. Now, what I do find interesting is that as we move forward out of the medieval period into the early modern period, we still see that these portrait heads are very, very, very common. This one coming out of Benin a little bit further to the south from Ife and a little bit later. But over time, they begin to become much more exaggerated and stylized and abstracted as they go forward. So here we can see an example from the 1550s. Once again, this would be done for the exact same reasons. It's meant to represent a prominent individual that we would be using for a form of ancestral worship. But we can see in this case different tribes, so different, kind of markings. We don't have facial scarification. Instead, we have the use of very, very elaborate beadwork. I especially love the headdress here. Once again, very elaborate beadwork going on, even beadwork in the hair and everything like this. But as we go forward, we start to see that they become even more exaggerated over time. So here we can see an example from the early or the late 19th century, about 300 years after our previous example. But once again, we can see this is an extremely prominent individual wearing a wide variety of, different, jewelry. So not only this very elaborate kind of beaded necklace, but also the same kind of beaded headdress that we see here. However, this is probably a female representation, whereas this is probably a chieftain because we have the addition of these other crown-like elements. But once again, we can see that this kind of aesthetic trend of rather elaborate exaggeration and abstraction of the human form is very prevalent. Now, something I find interesting is that when Europeans first arrived in Africa, in Benin especially in the 16th century, they were very impressed not only by these bronze statues, but also by palaces and cities comparable to Europe at that time. And so I tend to feel that there is a lot of racism that goes into how people in the Western world think about Africa and African societies, and that there's somehow low or not as well developed or more primitive or whatever, but that's not the case at all. In fact, a lot of that is used as a form of racism to uphold white supremacy and all of this kind of idea. But in fact, the city of Benin was a major metropolitan area. It supported upwards of 200,000 to 300,000 people originally, and this is a Portuguese depiction of Benin City. It's a little hard to see, but there's a wall back here, and the wall of Benin was actually a 20-foot tall wall that was over 30 miles long, and it encircled this huge area. In fact, unfortunately, it doesn't survive to this day. It was largely destroyed during the 19th century. But once again, this is, a kind of interesting aspect of African societies at this time. In fact, during the Middle Ages, the richest person alive was an African king from Mali. and everything like that. But we also see other kinds of artwork. Once again, more votive or honorific types of artwork. This is a particularly interesting one coming out of Benin because it shows influence of Europeans somewhat. But what we see represented here is what's known as an ivory pendant mask, and it's meant to be representative of Queen Idia, who was the kind of queen mother of the king that it was made for. But what we see is actually a portrait mask. It's more of a talisman. It's only about yay big or so. But this would have been worn by the king on a necklace. So it would be a form of kind of ancestral worship, or at least veneration, if you will. But it also shows some influence of European contact as well, and we'll see that in a second. But we can also see these two striations in the forehead. This would have originally held a little device that we could burn incense out of, or at least would hold kind of incense or other kind of sacred ointments or things like that. But if we do look at it a little bit closer, we can see some interesting kind of symbolic motifs going on. And what we actually have here are two motifs that vary, that they kind of, one and then the other. But we see a mudfish and a Portuguese man. And these are symbolic for a few reasons. The mudfish, in this particular sense, is a symbol of immortality. And so once again, hearkening to this idea of ancestral worship, in that our ancestors don't die, they just go into the spirit realm where they can help influence our lives and everything like that. Because the mudfish, if we're unfamiliar, during the dry season, it will kind of cocoon itself in this mud pouch and bury itself underneath a riverbed, and then it waits out the dry season, and then when the rains come, it kind of emerges forth again. So it seemed to have connotations to immortality. But aside from that, we also have these Portuguese guys, and we know they're Portuguese based on the kind of hat that they're wearing, as well as their kind of elaborate handlebar mustaches there. But it's known that, when the Portuguese kind of arrived in Benin, they helped the king resolve some major issues in conflict with some of their enemies and whatnot. And so they've been honored as such in this particular pendant. I find that to be kind of interesting as well, given the context that will come later out of European contact with West Africa, with slavery and, all of that horrible, horrible stuff. But it is an interesting representation, in my opinion. It's just, it's kind of strange that they did this. However, aside from, pendant masks and honorific kind of, artworks, we also have more ritualistic kinds of artwork coming out of Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. So most of the artwork that we're probably more familiar with, such as, dance masks, things like that, are all serving a much more ritualistic type of purpose. And so here we can see one such example. This is what's known as a Tiwara antelope headdress, and this is one of a duo, and we'll see a picture of the other version of this, that are used by the Bamana people in agricultural ceremonies. So within their mythology, the Tiwara, or these antelope, are the beings that teach agriculture to the Bamana people in the kind of mythical time before time. And so these kind of headdresses, if you will, are used in association with rituals related to agriculture. And so once again, though, we can see that very much like the rest of our kind of aesthetic from this region, we have this rather extremely stylized, abstracted kind of quality. So it gives the sense of an antelope, but it's, rather, kind of divorced from naturalistic reality, if you will. But here we can see just another example. Both of these examples are meant to represent the male attribute of the Tiwara. There is a female, headdress mask that's associated with this as well. We'll see in just a second. But once again, depending, they can be, fairly simple, such as the one we see here, or they can be a little bit more elaborate here and there and everything like that. But here we can see how it would actually be used, and we can also see the male versus the female attribute here. So the female mask usually also has a kind of, calf associated with it as well. But we can see that these headdresses would be worn in association with a costume, and the kind of shaman or the dancers, performers that are wearing these would actually perform a ritual by circling an agricultural field in these dresses. They would be singing specific songs, doing this ritualistic dance, and all of this is meant to increase the fertility of the field. So, hence the male and female attributes here. So that way we can ensure that our crops are going to grow well and that we're going to have a good harvest and all of these kinds of things. So many of these kinds of headdresses in this region of the world are also going to be used in these kind of ritual senses. And we'll see a few more examples of that as well. But aside from headdresses, we also have a plethora of carved figures. Many of them are representative of important individuals within the society. Once again, here we can see a seated male with a lance from the Bamana people. So this would be a prominent warrior within the society. Once again, this is probably an effigy that would be used for a kind of votive type purpose. So an honorific type of use in a kind of religious sense and everything like that. But we can see once again this rather extreme kind of elongation of the human form, especially in the torso on this particular individual. But we can also see the use of elaborate hairstyles, jewelry. In this case, he's wearing an armband with a knife. He's got this very interesting kind of helmet made out of crocodile skin, all kinds of different things like that. But some of them, like this is a fairly representational, or at least a little bit more realistic kind of figure, but some of them tend to be even more exaggerated. So here we can see a Dogon figure. So this is a koro player. So this is someone playing a musical instrument in association with one of these ritualistic dances. So this would also be used as a kind of votive figure, if you will, for honorific use. Many of these kinds of carvings are going to be used for these honorific or votive type purposes. But once again, we can see once again this kind of stylized elongation of the human form, and once again a wide variety of different cultural markings. So the hairstyle, the jewelry that the individual is wearing would also harken to our tribal identity and everything like that. Now, aside from these kinds of carved figures, we also, once again, have a wide variety of like ritual masks. This is probably what sub-Saharan Africa is really most well known for in an artistic sense. You see these all the time. Tourists bring them back all the time. But there are some interesting ones. This is one of my more favorite examples. And this is really something that's I find very interesting based on how the artist who created this is using pattern and texture to emphasize certain elements. And so this is a large dance headdress, also from the Bamende people of Cameroon, a little bit further to the south from where we were just talking about. But this particular mask is meant to represent a kind of boogeyman, if you will. So this is a mask that would be worn in a ceremonial dance to kind of scare children into, behaving and everything like that. But it has this kind of frightening appearance. Frightening in a kind of shocking way. But I really, really enjoy the elaborated eyes on this. And so once again, we can see this very extreme kind of abstraction and, kind of elongation of the human features. These kind of oval eyes, especially, are a major feature of many of these masks. I like the idea that the kind of eyebrows on this, which are accentuated by these kind of linear forms, are meant to echo this kind of idea of like your eyes opening up and like light radiating from them or spirit radiating from them in one way or another. But once again, this is a mask that would be used in ritual like practice and everything like that. Many of them also have elaborate costumes associated with them, kind of like the tiwara, headdresses we saw just a second ago. And these costumes also help to accentuate the dance that takes place in them. So they kind of, flutter and make noise within that context as well. So it's really kind of an overarching experience. But once again, these masks vary quite a bit depending on who we're talking about, what group we're talking about, etc., etc. So here we can see a Nagdi Mawash mask, also coming from sub-Saharan Africa, further south from there. But instead of wood carving like we see with this one from the Bamenda area, we can see that this one is making use of not only, wood carving, but fabric, shells, beadwork, and kind of elaborate decorative painting as well. So, but once again, we can still see this kind of elaboration on the human features. So those very kind of oval-linear eyes, all this kind of stuff. But once again, depending on what tribe we're talking about or what, kind of group we're talking about, these masks are going to take on much different connotations. They're going to use different materials, etc., etc., etc. So here we can see just another example of one that would be used in dance. I like this one because not only do we have a little bit different kind of elaboration on the human features, so instead of oval or kind of almond shaped eyes, we have these kind of cone eyes that come out at us, which I find interesting. But we can also see some of the costume aspect that would also be associated with this. This is probably also something very akin to what those bronze portraits might have had attached to give a much more naturalistic sense to them. But once again, this kind of grass or reed work that's down here would shake and flutter as we wore the mask in the ritual dance, and it would create noise and things that accentuate the rhythm and all kinds of things like that. It also, if you ever see or get to see like video of this being done, it gives it this kind of fluidity of motion to it that makes it look almost otherworldly as well. That's rather interesting in that regard. Now, aside from masks, we also have, artworks that convey cultural information as well. So here we can see these are what are known as Yoruba house posts. And these are literally, serve us a utilitarian function in that they hold up the entryway or the roof of a house, but they also have symbolic motifs that are meant to convey cultural meaning to the Yoruba people in general. And so what we usually see here is a depiction of a man and two women in these posts, and they're meant to echo this idea of not only hospitality, but also of the caring nature of the tribe, as well as the nurturing nature of the tribe. So usually, you'll see a man, which usually represents not only strength and power and things like that, but you'll usually see two women depicted. One, such as in this one, in the center here, is usually holding their breasts, which is a kind of traditional sign of welcoming. Once again, we have to divorce ourselves away from our own cultural connotations and look at this from a different perspective. However, one of the other women is usually preparing food, which is also meant to echo this idea of hospitality. Usually, sometimes they'll also be holding a child or something like that. So they can vary quite a bit, but you'll usually see at least some connotation to welcoming and hospitality and, all of these kinds of ideas represented in these types of works. But here we can see an image of how these would actually be displayed. So this is actually a chieftain's house, but we can see several of these posts being used to hold up the roof here on the entryway. But once again, this would be a sign of welcoming into the community, a sign of hospitality, and all of this kind of idea. Now, not all African art is made for royal or honorific use. Much of African art is meant for ritual purposes or to influence the future or to secure social order, these kinds of ideas. So, once again, they're being used for ritual practice, but not quite in the same way. So there are a wide variety of different ritual type objects. And one of the more interesting ones, in my opinion, and you'll see quite a bit of these, are what are known as mangaka power figures, and they might vary by name accordingly. But this is an interesting figure in that this is a type of artwork that is meant to kind of act as a judicial system, if you will. So what would take place is that, let's say we have two parties that are at odds with one another. They have a conflict that needs to be resolved. Well, they would come together and they would try to resolve that conflict. And once they came to some resolution, they would place a nail or another metal object into one of these figures. And so that's meant to cement the kind of pact or agreement that they've come to. And so the more, nails that are driven into one of these figures, the more power it's said to have in the resolution of conflict, of wars and anger and all kinds of things like that. So we can see, obviously, this particular piece has been used quite a bit. So it would have been considered to have quite a good deal of power associated with it and everything like that. But we can also see that it's not just made out of wood. It's also made with precious inlay. In this case, we have ivory or shell, which are being used for not only the teeth, but the eyes in this as well. We can also see this kind of hole in the center of the figure. And this is an area where we would place incense or other things so that the incense would help to carry our, grievances into the spiritual world. And once again, this would be something that echoes the power of the figure itself, and all of these kinds of ideas. But they're once again, they're very, very common. They're quite extensive. I've seen quite a few even here in the United States that have been brought over. But once again, they're used for more kind of judiciary practice or ritual rather than, say, religious practice or ritual. So all kinds of different artworks are made in that regard. Now, just to end us off really quick for Africa, one of the other major, aspects of, Western and Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in like places like Nigeria, in particular, are this kind of design aesthetic that's known as kente cloth. And you might have seen this. It's very, very common. I've seen a lot of people of African descent, even in Texas, that wear their kente cloth around. But these are interesting in that the cloth is actually woven from a variety of colors. Each color has specific symbolic connotations. So gold tends to be, wealth and kingly power. Green tends to be like, renewal, rebirth, things like that. There's a whole huge list of different connotations, but each color would represent something. But also the patterns that we use would also indicate important cultural meaning as well. So, and additionally, the patterns that we use in association with one another would also convey specific meaning to the individual or the kind of tribal group or, what have you. So in this particular sense, we can see two different patterns being used together in this sense. But if we look, we can see this is a modern picture of, chieftains in Nigeria, but we can see all of the different varieties that this kente cloth can take on. It's quite varied, and once again, each one of these different patterns would convey different information to the wearer and to those who beheld it and everything like that. So I've always found that to be kind of interesting as well. And once again, we can use simple things for symbolic meaning rather than outright kind of figurative representations and allegorical kinds of ways and things like that. So I find that to be kind of interesting as well. So we're going to end here for today, and on the next lecture we're going to pick up looking at Oceania, the Australias, and the Americas. So we'll see you next time.